The Solara, a majestic starship gliding through the silent void of space, cut an imposing figure against the backdrop of twinkling stars. Its sleek, silver hull shimmered faintly in the starlight, a beacon of human ingenuity and ambition. Yet, inside the ship, the atmosphere was far from serene. Captain Cale Draven stood on the command deck, facing the expansive viewport that displayed the boundless galaxy beyond, lost in his thoughts. The mission they had been assigned was unlike any other in his long career with the Galactic Diplomatic Corps, and the weight of it pressed heavily on his broad shoulders. Cale's jaw clenched as he mentally replayed the mission details. The Solara had been sent on a diplomatic venture to establish first contact with the elusive Valerians, an alien species known for their extraordinary telepathic abilities. No one had ever come close to making an alliance with the Valerians, but now, after years of silence and avoidance, they had finally agreed to meet under strange and specific terms. The terms themselves were unsettling. The Valerians had requested an intimate connection, something deeper than words or diplomacy. The mission wasn't simply to negotiate a treaty, it was to forge a bond that transcended language, culture, and species. And that bond, they insisted, had to be made with one person, Cale himself. As he stood, gazing out into the abyss, the soft hiss of the door behind him broke the stillness. Lieutenant Aria Voss, his second-in-command, entered the room with her usual efficient stride, her datapad clutched tightly in her hand. Aria was sharp, professional, and always by the book, but even she had been unusually quiet since the briefing. "Captain," she said, her voice firm yet laced with the concern she couldn't hide, "we've received confirmation from the Valerians. They're ready for you." Cale didn't turn to face her immediately. He kept his gaze on the stars, the millions of pinpricks of light that stretched out endlessly before him. He was a man accustomed to action, to decisive moves in the face of uncertainty. But this mission, this demand from the Valerians was different. It required a vulnerability that went beyond anything he had ever encountered before. "I expected as much," he finally replied, his voice calm but distant. Inside, however, his mind was spinning with questions. What exactly did the Valerians want from him? And why him specifically? "They've asked for you alone," Aria continued, stepping closer. Her eyes flickered with something that resembled worry, a rare expression for the otherwise stoic officer. "I still don't understand why they've made that demand. This kind of personal connection. It's unheard of in diplomatic missions." Cale nodded slightly, his thoughts aligning with hers. The Valerians had been enigmatic ever since they first appeared at the fringes of human space, their ships hovering in the distance but never making contact. For years, they had been a source of mystery and speculation, an advanced race with powers beyond human comprehension. Their telepathic abilities were well documented, but beyond that, little was known. They had never shown any real interest in human affairs. Until now. Aria handed Cale the datapad, her fingers brushing against his as she did. "This is the last intel we've gathered on the Valerians. It's not much, but there are some theories about their culture and their bonding rituals." Cale raised an eyebrow, finally tearing his gaze away from the stars to look at her. Bonding rituals. Aria sighed, tapping the screen to bring up a report. "It's mostly conjecture. But it seems the Valerians don't communicate in the way we're used to. Their entire society is based on mental and emotional connections, telepathic links that go beyond mere conversation. They believe true communication comes from sharing everything, even their deepest thoughts and feelings." Cale frowned as he read through the data. The implications were clear. This wasn't just about diplomacy. It was about opening his mind to an alien species in ways that went far beyond traditional negotiations. And the Valerians had made it explicit that only one person could establish this connection. Him. "They're not interested in words," Captain Aria said, her voice softer now. "They want you to bond with them on a personal level." Cale's mind raced. This wasn't what he had signed up for. Diplomacy, sure. He had dealt with hostile alien races, difficult negotiations, even the threat of war. But this was different. This was intimate. And something about it unsettled him in ways he wasn't sure he could explain. "They wouldn't have asked for this if they weren't serious about establishing a real connection," Cale muttered, trying to convince himself as much as her. "We've been trying to make contact with them for years. If this is what it takes to secure an alliance, then I'll do it." Aria studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. "Are you sure? There's still time to reconsider. This isn't like any mission we've ever undertaken. You'll be exposed in ways that go beyond protocol." Cale chuckled softly, though there was little humor in it. "I appreciate the concern, Lieutenant, but this is what we're here for. The Valerians are a potential ally too valuable to ignore. If they want a connection, then I'll give it to them. It's my duty." Aria's lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes betraying the concern she still held. "Just promise me one thing, Captain. If something doesn't feel right, don't hesitate to abort the mission. We need you to come back." In one piece, Cale smiled, a rare softness breaking through his normally hardened exterior. He appreciated her loyalty more than he could put into words. "I'll keep that in mind," he said, though his tone remained resolute. With that, Aria gave a nod and turned to leave, her boots echoing faintly against the pristine floor. When the door slid shut behind her, Kale was left alone once more, standing in the quiet hum of the command deck. His eyes drifted back to the stars, but his thoughts were far from the infinite beauty before him. The weight of the mission settled heavily on him again. This wasn't just about humanity's future. It wasn't just about securing a new ally. It was personal. The Valerians had made that clear. Whatever they wanted from him, it wasn't just a formal exchange of ideas. They wanted him, his mind, his emotions, his deepest thoughts. He ran a hand through his dark hair, the tension in his muscles building as he thought about what awaited him on the other side of that docking bay. The Valerian emissary, Talia, had already reached out to him through their initial telepathic contact. It had been brief, just a soft whisper at the edge of his consciousness, but it was enough to let him know what he was dealing with. Talia's presence had been strange, not invasive, but personal, intimate in a way he hadn't expected. Her thoughts had brushed against his like a soft caress, testing his boundaries, feeling him out. It was as if she had reached into his mind and grazed the edges of his soul. And that had only been the beginning. Kale shivered at the memory of that connection, feeling the remnants of it still lingering in the back of his mind. She was out there now on the Valerian ship, waiting for him, waiting for their connection to deepen in ways that he couldn't fully comprehend. He had been trained to maintain control in every situation, but this was different. This was going to test him in ways that no training could prepare him for. A soft chime interrupted his thoughts, the ship's AI breaking the silence with its calm, synthesized voice. "Captain Draven, the Valerians have confirmed their readiness. You are requested in Docking Bay 3. Kale exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders finally releasing as he squared himself for what was to come. This was it. No turning back now. Whatever awaited him on that Valerian ship, whatever connection they sought, he would face it head-on. He had no other choice. As he made his way through the pristine corridors of the Solara, the weight of his duty pressed down on him with every step. His boots clanged rhythmically against the metal floor, the sound steady, reassuring. Crew members passed him, nodding in silent acknowledgement, though none of them knew the true nature of his mission. Secrecy was paramount here. The fewer people involved, the better. Finally, he reached Docking Bay 3. The large doors hissed open, revealing the vast, sterile space of the docking area. And there, standing at the other end, was the portal to the Valerian vessel, a sleek, dark tunnel that seemed to hum with a life of its own. Kale hesitated for just a moment, taking in a deep breath to steady himself. Then, with a final nod to the crew around him, he stepped forward, into the unknown. As he crossed the threshold, the ambient noise of the Solara vanished, replaced by an eerie stillness. The air in the Valerian ship was cooler, with a faint metallic scent that was oddly calming. The ship itself seemed alive, the walls pulsing gently as if they were breathing, waiting for him to make his next move. And waiting at the center of the room was Talia, her violet eyes locking onto his the moment he entered. She stood tall and graceful, her silver skin shimmering faintly under the soft blue light. Her presence was overwhelming, yet inviting, drawing him deeper into her world, into her mind. "Welcome, Kale Draven," Talia's voice echoed in his mind, her telepathic connection brushing against him once more. "You've come as requested." Kale swallowed hard, the full reality of what he was about to undertake finally settling in. This was it. The moment he had been preparing for. The moment he couldn't walk away from. "I'm here," he replied, his voice steady, but inside he knew that everything was about to change. And there was no turning back. The air inside the Valerian vessel felt different the moment Captain Kale Draven crossed the threshold. It wasn't just the temperature, though the cooler air held a metallic scent that seemed to hum faintly with energy. No, it was something else, something deeper, almost imperceptible. The atmosphere was charged, alive, as though the ship itself was aware of his presence, waiting for him to take the next step. Kale paused for a brief moment, allowing his eyes to adjust to the dim, ambient blue light that bathed the interior of the ship. The light seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, pulsing in a slow, rhythmic pattern that reminded him of a heartbeat. The silence was profound, a stark contrast to the ever-present hum of machinery aboard the Solara. Here there was only stillness. The ship seemed to absorb sound, muting every footstep, every breath, creating a disorienting sense of isolation. It felt as though the very walls were watching him, waiting to see what he would do next. His senses were on high alert, every fiber of his being taut with anticipation. He had been briefed on the Valerians, their culture, their telepathic abilities, their reclusive nature, but none of that could have truly prepared him for this moment. The knowledge that they could see into his mind, that they would seek a connection more intimate than anything he had ever experienced, weighed heavily on him. He was used to being in control, used to managing negotiations and keeping his thoughts guarded. But here, in this strange ship, with the Valerians expecting something deeper, he felt exposed in a way he hadn't anticipated. Kale moved forward, his footsteps almost soundless on the smooth, iridescent floor. The corridor curved gently, the walls arching gracefully overhead, giving the space an organic, almost fluid feel. It was unlike any alien vessel he had ever set foot on before. There were no harsh lines, no sharp corners, just smooth surfaces that seemed to pulse with life. As he rounded the corner, his heart quickened. He knew what was waiting for him. At the end of the corridor was a large circular chamber, the light inside brighter but still soft, casting long shadows that danced along the walls. And there, standing in the center of the room, was Talia, the Valerian emissary he had come to meet. Cale stopped in his tracks, his breath catching in his throat as he took in the sight of her. She was taller than any human woman he had ever seen, her frame slender but strong, radiating a quiet, otherworldly grace. Her skin, a deep silver, shimmered with faint iridescent hues as the light from the room played across her body. Delicate, intricate patterns almost like glowing tattoos shifted and pulsed along her skin, seemingly tied to her emotions. Her eyes, large and almond-shaped, were a striking shade of violet, glowing faintly as they locked onto his. For a moment, Cale felt as if time had stopped. There was something about her presence, something both unsettling and captivating. She wasn't just beautiful in the conventional sense, her beauty was alien, ethereal, like something out of a dream. And yet, beneath that strange elegance, there was a familiarity in the way she held herself, in the softness of her expression. She looked at him with a curiosity that mirrored his own, as if they were both trying to figure out what came next. Captain Cale Draven, Talia's voice echoed softly in his mind, bypassing his ears entirely. Her words flowed directly into his consciousness, a telepathic connection that felt both intimate and powerful. "You've come, as expected." Cale nodded, finding his voice, though it felt strangely inadequate in the face of her direct mental communication. "Talia," he replied, his voice steady but quieter than he intended. "It's an honor to finally meet you." Talia's lips curved into the smallest of smiles, a gesture so subtle it might have been missed if Cale hadn't been watching her so closely. "I've heard much about you, Captain," she continued, her voice still a presence inside his mind. "You are the one they have chosen to represent your people in this connection." The way she said the word connection made Cale's pulse quicken. He had been briefed on the Valerians' telepathic abilities, on their unique method of communication that went far beyond words. The Galactic Diplomatic Corps had stressed the importance of this connection, how it was not simply an exchange of thoughts but a merging of minds, a sharing of emotions and memories. It was a bond that could not be entered into lightly. "I am," Cale replied, standing a little taller, trying to match the resolve in her gaze. "We both know how important this is, for my people and for yours." Talia tilted her head slightly, her violet eyes narrowing as if she were studying him, measuring him. "Yes," she murmured, her mental voice soft yet probing. "But are you ready? Are you truly prepared for what the connection demands of you?" Her question lingered in the air between them, and Cale hesitated for just a fraction of a second. He had been trained for this mission, had undergone countless psychological evaluations, had prepared himself in every way possible for this encounter. But could anyone truly be ready for what the Valerians were asking? To open one's mind so fully, to let down every defense, to allow another being to see into the deepest corners of your soul. "I am ready," he said, his voice firm though the tension in his body betrayed the uncertainty he tried to hide. "Whatever it takes." Talia's smile deepened just enough to be noticeable now. She took a slow step toward him, her movements fluid and graceful, as though the air itself parted for her. There was no sound as her feet touched the floor, no disturbance in the stillness of the chamber. She was like a specter, ethereal and otherworldly, and Cale could feel his heart race as she drew nearer. "I sense your resolve," she said, her mental voice flowing through him like a warm current. "But I also sense your fear." Cale swallowed hard, trying to keep his thoughts under control. "I've been trained to protect my thoughts," he admitted, though the effort to do so felt futile in the presence of her telepathic power. Talia smiled again, this time more fully. "You won't need that here, Captain," she said, her voice softer now, almost reassuring. "We must connect. Let down your guard." He could feel her presence brushing against the edges of his consciousness, testing his defenses, waiting for him to open himself to her. It was unlike anything he had ever experienced. There was no hostility in her touch, no force, just a gentle pressure that urged him to let go, to trust her. Cale's heart pounded in his chest, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This was what he had been sent here to do, and yet now, standing before her, the reality of it felt overwhelming. His mind raced with questions, doubts. What would she see when she looked inside him? Would she see the fear he worked so hard to hide, the insecurities buried beneath his composed exterior? "You're holding back," Talia observed, her voice a whisper in his mind. "Don't be afraid, Cale. The connection is not something to fear. It is a gift." He met her gaze, and for the first time he saw something in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Vulnerability. She was asking for trust, not just offering to take his thoughts but to share her own in return. This wasn't just a test of his strength. It was an exchange, a merging of who they were at their core. Slowly, Cale nodded. He took a deep breath, feeling the tension in his body begin to release. "I'm ready," he said again, and this time he meant it. Talia stepped closer, her violet eyes locked onto his. She reached out, her long, slender fingers hovering just inches from his temple, her touch light as a feather. "May I?" she asked, though her voice echoed softly in his mind. Kale hesitated for only a moment before nodding. Yes. Her fingers brushed against his skin, and in that instant, the connection began. It was like nothing Kale had ever experienced. His mind opened, his thoughts spilling out like water from a broken dam. He could feel Talia's presence flooding into him, her thoughts intertwining with his, her emotions washing over him in waves. It was as if their minds were no longer separate but merging into one, their consciousnesses overlapping in a way that defied explanation. Images flashed before his eyes, memories that weren't his, moments from Talia's life, her world. He saw her people, the vast, shimmering cities of Valeria, the faces of those she loved, the responsibilities she carried. And she saw him, his past, his struggles, the battles he had fought, the loneliness he had hidden behind his duty. The connection was overwhelming, but it wasn't painful. It was intimate, raw, and powerful. Kale could feel the depth of Talia's emotions, her longing for connection, for understanding. And she could feel the desire to bridge the gap between their species, to find common ground in a galaxy so often divided by fear and misunderstanding. For what felt like an eternity, they stood there, their minds intertwined, their souls laid bare. There were no secrets, no lies, just the pure, unfiltered truth of who they were. When Talia finally withdrew her hand, the connection lingered between them, a bond that couldn't be broken. Kale felt different, changed by the experience in ways he couldn't fully comprehend. He had been prepared for a mission of diplomacy, but this had become something far more personal. "You are ready," Talia whispered, her voice filled with quiet certainty. Kale nodded, his heart still racing, his mind still reeling from the intensity of the experience. "So are you." They had taken the first step, and there was no turning back. The moment Talia's fingers touched Kale's temple, the world around him seemed to dissolve, replaced by something far more profound and disorienting. His senses were overwhelmed by the sudden flood of thoughts, emotions, and memories that surged into his mind. It was as if a door had been opened, one that could never be closed again, and through it, Talia poured herself into him, her presence wrapping around his consciousness like a warm, ethereal embrace. For a brief moment, Kale panicked. His instincts screamed at him to pull back, to shield himself from the invasion of his mind, to rebuild the mental walls he had spent years perfecting. But then he felt something strange, something calming. It wasn't an invasion at all. There was no force, no violence in her telepathic touch. It was a gentle caress, a quiet, steady presence that beckoned him to relax, to trust her. Kale's breath slowed as he let himself lean into the connection. He had been trained for this, but no amount of training could have prepared him for the raw intimacy of what was happening. His thoughts, his memories, his deepest emotions were laid bare before her, but instead of feeling vulnerable, he felt seen. It was as though she wasn't just reading his mind, but understanding him on a level that no one had ever reached before. In that instant, he could feel Talia's presence fully. She wasn't a distant, cold entity probing his mind. She was warm, curious, and above all, kind. Her thoughts flowed into his like a river, gentle and steady, and as they intertwined, Kale realized just how different this experience was from anything he had imagined. This wasn't just a connection, it was a merging of their very beings. "Relax," Talia's voice whispered through the bond, soothing and calm. "You're safe with me." Kale closed his eyes and allowed himself to let go, to surrender to the pull of her mind. He felt the tension in his muscles melt away as he gave himself over to the connection. Slowly, his own thoughts began to shift and mingle with hers, creating a symphony of emotions, memories, and sensations that were both his and hers. Suddenly, Kale found himself in a place that wasn't the Valerian ship. He was standing in the middle of a vast, glittering city. The buildings around him towered impossibly high, their surfaces shimmering like polished silver in the light of a twin sun sky. The air was warm, filled with the scent of strange, fragrant flowers and the soft hum of energy coursing through the very fabric of the world. He looked down at his hands, surprised to see them glowing faintly with a soft silver light. His whole body seemed to shimmer, as if he were a part of this alien world. He realized then that this wasn't just a dream or a vision, he was inside Talia's memories. He was seeing Valeria as she saw it, feeling the beauty and majesty of her home as if it were his own. "This is where I come from," Talia's voice echoed in his mind, soft but filled with a quiet pride. "This is Valeria." Kale turned slowly, taking in the full scope of the city around him. It was breathtaking, more magnificent than any place he had ever seen. The architecture was both elegant and organic, as though the buildings had grown from the earth itself, shaped by the will of the Valerians. The streets were wide and filled with people, tall, graceful beings like Talia, their silver skin shimmering in the light, their violet eyes glowing with an inner fire. He could feel their emotions, their thoughts, flowing like a steady current beneath the surface of their interactions. The connection between the Valerians was unlike anything Kale had ever encountered. It wasn't just communication, it was a constant sharing of their minds, a collective consciousness that tied them all together in a bond that went beyond words or actions. It was both beautiful and overwhelming, and Kale felt a pang of longing as he realized how different it was from his own world, where individuals were so often isolated, cut off from one another's thoughts and feelings. "You've never experienced this before, have you?" Talia's voice came again, this time with a note of understanding. the closeness, the openness. Kale shook his head, though he knew she could feel his response without words. No, he admitted. Not like this. Not even close. He could feel Talia's presence move closer to him, though they weren't physically together. In this shared mental space, it felt as if she were standing right beside him, her warmth radiating through the connection. Her thoughts brushed against his, tender and comforting. We are connected, all of us, she explained, her voice soft yet filled with a quiet strength. On Valeria, there is no separation between individuals. We share everything, our thoughts, our emotions, our memories. It is how we understand one another, how we build trust and unity. Kale's chest tightened as he thought of his own world, of how different things were among humans. People hid their emotions, their thoughts, building walls around themselves to protect their vulnerabilities. The idea of sharing one's mind so completely was almost unthinkable to most humans. But here, in this moment, in this connection with Talia, Kale realized how beautiful that openness could be. As if sensing his thoughts, Talia's presence shifted, and suddenly the city of Valeria faded away, replaced by a more personal memory. Kale now stood in a quiet, open field, the grass beneath his feet soft and glowing faintly in the twilight. Above him, the sky was dark but filled with stars, more stars than he had ever seen in his life. They stretched endlessly in every direction, casting a soft, silvery light over the landscape. And there, in the middle of the field, stood Talia. She wasn't the proud, composed emissary he had met aboard the ship. Here, in this place, she seemed different, softer, more vulnerable. Her violet eyes still glowed with that otherworldly light, but they held a sadness that Kale hadn't seen before. She looked up at the stars, her arms wrapped around herself as if seeking comfort from the vastness of the sky. Kale approached her slowly, his footsteps silent on the soft grass. He could feel her emotions now, more clearly than ever, her longing, her loneliness, the weight of the responsibility she carried. She had been alone for so long, separated from her people, her home, to serve as the bridge between her world and his. And while she carried out her duties with grace and strength, it had taken a toll on her. I never thought I would feel this way, Talia's voice came softly, filled with a quiet vulnerability. I've been trained my whole life to be strong, to be the one who forges connections between worlds. But it is lonely. Kale's heart ached at the rawness of her words. He could feel the depth of her isolation, her need for connection, for understanding. It mirrored his own in ways he hadn't realized until now. All his life, he had been the one in control, the one who kept his emotions locked away behind walls of duty and discipline. But here, with Talia, those walls were crumbling. Without thinking, Kale reached out, his hand brushing against her arm. The contact sent a ripple through the connection, a wave of warmth and understanding that passed between them in an instant. Talia turned to face him, her violet eyes searching his, and in that moment they were no longer strangers from different worlds. They were simply two beings, connected by something far deeper than words. I know that loneliness, Kale whispered, his voice filled with an honesty he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time. I've felt it my whole life, even when I was surrounded by people. But with you, it's different. I don't feel alone anymore. Talia's expression softened, her eyes shimmering with unspoken emotion. She stepped closer to him, her presence enveloping him in warmth. And for the first time, Kale realized just how much this connection meant to her as well. She had opened herself to him, shown him the most intimate parts of her mind, her heart, in a way that went far beyond duty or obligation. This was personal. Kale's breath caught as the intensity of their connection deepened. He could feel everything she was feeling, the warmth of her emotions, the rawness of her vulnerability, the hope that had taken root between them. And in return, he knew she could feel him, the desire to bridge the gap between their worlds, the need to protect her, to hold on to this connection and never let it go. As they stood together in that shared mental space, the stars above them glowing softly, Kale felt a surge of emotion he hadn't expected. It was more than just attraction, more than just the novelty of their bond. It was something deeper, something that went straight to the core of who they were. For the first time in his life, Kale felt truly understood, seen, not just for the man he presented to the world, but for the man he was inside. I see you, Talia whispered, her voice filled with quiet awe. And you are stronger than you know. Kale's breath hitched in his throat as her words settled over him. He had never felt so exposed, so vulnerable, but there was no fear. Only trust. Only the quiet, unshakable knowledge that they were in this together, that their connection was something powerful, something real. The atmosphere between them had shifted, charged with a tension that neither of them could ignore any longer. Kale could feel it in the way Talia's violet eyes lingered on his, in the soft pull of the connection they had formed, tugging them closer in ways that went far beyond mere diplomacy. Her presence was magnetic, and in the silence that stretched between them, the air seemed to hum with the unspoken emotions swirling between their minds. They had shared their thoughts, their memories, their most intimate vulnerabilities, but this, what was happening now, was different. It wasn't just about understanding anymore. It was about desire, pure and undeniable. Kale's heart raced as he stood inches from her, the warmth of her body so close, the faint glow of her silver skin shimmering in the soft light of the Valerian vessel. Every breath he took felt heavier, filled with the scent of her, something clean, floral, and distinctly alien, yet intoxicating. Talia's expression softened, her usual composed demeanor melting away as the connection between them deepened, pulling them both into a moment that felt suspended in time. Her thoughts brushed against his, but they were different now, less guarded, more vulnerable. He could feel her uncertainty, her hesitation, but also the yearning that mirrored his own. She wanted this as much as he did. Kale's hand moved almost on instinct, reaching out to gently cup the side of her face. Her skin was soft, warm under his touch, and the subtle glow of the intricate patterns on her skin pulsed faintly in response. Talia's breath hitched, her eyes widening for just a moment before they fluttered closed, leaning into his touch. The connection between them flared, a bright spark of emotion that surged through their bond, amplifying everything they felt. Talia, Kale whispered, his voice rough with the weight of everything unsaid. She opened her eyes, locking onto his with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. The room seemed to fade away, the world outside of them disappearing as they stood there, caught in the gravity of each other. There were no words left to speak. Everything they needed to say was already flowing through their connection, raw and unfiltered. And then slowly, as if testing the waters of something entirely new, Talia leaned in. Her movements were careful, hesitant, as if she were afraid to break the fragile moment between them. But Kale met her halfway, his lips brushing hers in a kiss that was tentative at first, soft and questioning. The contact sent a shock of warmth through him, a heat that spread from the point of their touch and ignited something deeper inside him. The kiss deepened, growing bolder as they gave in to the pull of the connection, to the desire that had been simmering beneath the surface since the moment their minds had touched. Talia's hands found their way to his shoulders, her fingers gripping him lightly, as if anchoring herself in the intensity of what they were sharing. Kale's other hand slid around her waist, pulling her closer until there was no space left between them, only the heat of their bodies and the raw, electric energy of their bond. It wasn't just a kiss, it was a merging of everything they were, their thoughts, their emotions, their very souls intertwining in a way that went beyond the physical. Kale could feel Talia's heartbeat through the connection, racing in time with his own, and her thoughts washed over him like a wave, her desire, her fear, her vulnerability, all laid bare for him to see. And in return, he let her feel him, let her see the depth of his own emotions, the need that had been building inside him since the moment they had first connected. Talia's kiss was soft, but it held a fierceness that Kale hadn't expected. She kissed him like she had been waiting for this moment for longer than either of them could understand, like she had finally found something she had been missing all her life. And Kale, for all his control and restraint, found himself lost in her, consumed by the intensity of what they were sharing. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were breathless, their foreheads resting against each other as they struggled to steady their racing hearts. The silence between them was thick with emotion, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was full, alive with the unspoken understanding that something had shifted between them, something that couldn't be undone. Talia opened her eyes, her gaze soft but intense as she searched his face, as if trying to make sense of what had just happened. Her lips were parted slightly, her breath coming in shallow, uneven gasps, and Kale could see the same mix of wonder and disbelief reflected in her violet eyes that he felt inside. "I didn't mean for this to happen," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "But I couldn't stop it." Kale smiled softly, brushing a strand of her silken hair away from her face. "Neither could I." Their bond, now stronger than ever, hummed quietly between them, a constant reminder that this wasn't just about the kiss. It was about everything they had shared, everything they had felt. The connection had unlocked something between them, something powerful and undeniable. Talia looked down for a moment, her fingers still gripping his shoulders as if she didn't want to let go. "This is dangerous," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "What we've started. It's not supposed to be like this." Kale gently tilted her chin up, forcing her to meet his eyes. "I don't care what's supposed to happen," he said firmly, his voice steady with conviction. It feels right." For a moment, Talia hesitated, her gaze flickering between his eyes, as if weighing the truth of his words. Then, slowly, her expression softened, and she gave him the smallest of smiles, one filled with quiet acceptance. "Maybe you're right," she whispered, her lips brushing his once more, soft and fleeting, but enough to send his heart racing again. "Maybe this is exactly what's supposed to happen." And with that, the fragile moment between them solidified into something stronger, something real. The atmosphere between them, already charged with tension, shifted into something electric, something undeniable. The connection that had begun as a gentle merging of thoughts and emotions now pulsed with an intensity that neither Kale nor Talia could resist. They had crossed a threshold that went far beyond mere diplomacy. This was something primal, raw, and deeply personal. Talia stood before Kale, her silver skin shimmering under the soft ambient light of the Valerian ship, her violet eyes dark with desire. He could feel her emotions swirling through their bond, an overwhelming mix of want, curiosity, and hesitation. Her thoughts brushed against his, gentle at first, but growing more insistent with each passing moment. Kale's breath quickened, matching the rhythm of the pulse between them, their connection crackling with energy like a storm on the horizon. Without words, they moved toward each other. There was no need for explanations or hesitations anymore. Their desires were laid bare, transmitted through the bond they shared. Kale's hand found its way to the small of her back, pulling her closer until their bodies were pressed together, her warmth flooding him. He could feel the soft hum of her energy vibrating through his skin, resonating with his own, drawing them even closer. Talia's fingers trailed lightly down Kale's chest, her touch igniting a fire within him. Her movements were slow, deliberate, as if savoring the sensation of his body beneath her hands. Every point of contact sent a shockwave of pleasure through him, heightened by the telepathic connection they shared. He could feel her desire as though it were his own, their emotions and sensations blending together until there was no distinction between them. They were no longer just two beings, they were one. The air around them seemed to thrum with the intensity of the moment, thick with anticipation. Kale's lips found hers again, but this time the kiss was deeper, hungrier. There was no longer any pretense, no careful restraint. Their need for each other was palpable, and they gave in to it fully. Talia responded with equal fervor, her hands sliding up to his shoulders, pulling him closer as if she couldn't get enough of him. The kiss deepened, their tongues dancing in a rhythm that mirrored the wild, chaotic energy swirling through their minds. Kale's hands moved down her sides, feeling the soft curve of her hips, the smoothness of her silver skin beneath his fingers. Her body felt alien and familiar at the same time, every touch amplified by the connection between them. He could feel her pleasure, her desire, echoing through his own body, and it only made him want her more. The room around them seemed to fade into the background, leaving only the two of them, lost in the storm they had created. Talia's breath came in short, sharp gasps as Kale's hands roamed over her body, exploring every inch of her. She pressed herself against him, her desire clear in the way her body responded to his touch, in the way her thoughts filled his mind with images of what she wanted, what they both wanted. The intensity of it was almost overwhelming, but neither of them wanted to stop. Their clothes fell away, discarded without thought, until there was nothing between them but skin and the shared heat of their bodies. The connection between their minds flared brighter, more urgent, as they surrendered completely to the pull of their bond. Kale could feel everything she felt, her pleasure, her need, her satisfaction, as if it were his own. Every movement, every touch was a shared experience, magnified by the telepathic link that bound them together. Talia's nails raked lightly down his back as they moved together, their bodies finding a rhythm that felt as natural as breathing. The sounds of their passion filled the room, her soft moans, his low groans, the gentle hum of the ship around them. Time seemed to slow, the intensity of the moment stretching into eternity, as they gave in to the storm of passion that had overtaken them. With every movement, every kiss, they grew closer, their bond deepening in ways that neither of them had anticipated. This was more than just a physical act, it was a merging of minds, bodies, and souls. Kale could feel the depth of Talia's emotions, her vulnerability and strength, her longing for connection and her fear of losing herself in it. And she could feel his desire to protect her, to understand her, to hold on to this moment for as long as he could. As they reached the peak of their shared passion, the connection between them burned hotter, brighter, until it was almost blinding in its intensity. Kale's mind was flooded with sensations, Talia's pleasure, her satisfaction, her deep, unspoken need for him. And in that moment, as they moved together in perfect harmony, he knew that this was more than just a fleeting encounter. It was the beginning of something far greater, something that would change them both forever. Their shared climax came like a wave, crashing over them in a surge of pure, unfiltered ecstasy. The bond between them pulsed with the force of it, their minds and bodies in perfect sync as they rode out the storm together. And when it was over, they lay together in the aftermath, their breathing heavy, their bodies still entwined, the connection between them humming softly, a steady reminder of the bond they now shared. Talia rested her head on Kale's chest, her fingers tracing lazy patterns across his skin as they lay in the quiet stillness of the room. He could feel her contentment, her satisfaction, through the bond, and it mirrored his own. The storm had passed, but the intensity of what they had shared lingered in the air around them, a constant, pulsing reminder that this was only the beginning. For a long time they stayed like that, their minds still linked, their bodies still close, neither of them wanting to break the silence. And in that moment, as they lay together, Kale knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. Their bond, forged in the storm of passion, was something unbreakable, something neither of them could ever walk away from. Talia looked up at him, her violet eyes soft but filled with an unspoken promise. "We are bound now, Kale," she whispered into his mind, her voice tender but resolute. "This is only the beginning." Kale smiled, his hand gently caressing her cheek as he leaned down to kiss her once more. "I know," he whispered back, "and I wouldn't have it any other way." The storm had come and gone, but the bond between them would endure, stronger and more unshakable than ever. Together, they would face whatever came next, united by the connection they had forged in the heat of their shared passion. The days after their intense encounter passed in a blur, but the weight of what had transpired between Kale and Talia never left them. Their bond, forged in passion and deeper connection, had grown stronger with each moment they spent together. It was undeniable now, a force that neither of them could ignore, but it also came with complications. Kale stood in the observation room of the Valerian ship, staring out into the endless sea of stars. His thoughts were a tangled web of duty, desire, and uncertainty. The mission had always been clear: establish a diplomatic bond with the Valerians, secure a future alliance for humanity. But now, things were no longer so simple. What had begun as a mission of diplomacy had evolved into something far more personal, far more intimate. The connection he shared with Talia was more than just telepathic. It was as if their very souls had intertwined, and every emotion she felt, every thought that crossed her mind, flowed through him as well. It wasn't just a mental bond anymore, it was love, pure and undeniable. And that love came with a choice. Behind him, Kale sensed Talia's presence before she spoke. Her footsteps were soft, graceful as always, but the weight of her emotions pressed against his consciousness like a heavy cloud. She didn't need to say anything for him to feel the turmoil she carried within her. Their connection had become so deep that words felt almost unnecessary. "Kale," she said softly, her voice like a whisper carried on the breeze. "We need to talk." He turned to face her, his chest tightening at the sight of her. Talia stood in the dim light of the observation deck, her violet eyes glowing softly in the reflection of the stars. She looked both beautiful and conflicted, her silver skin catching the light as she stepped closer. Her emotions flowed into him: her love for him, her fear, her uncertainty about what came next. "I know," he replied, his voice rough with emotion. "We can't avoid this forever." Talia stopped just a few feet from him, her gaze locking onto his. She was taller than him, her presence commanding, yet there was a vulnerability in her eyes that Kale had come to recognize. The fierce, strong emissary he had first met was still there, but now she was something more: a woman torn between her duty and the love they had found together. "We're at a crossroads," she said quietly, her hands clasping in front of her as if to steady herself. "I've tried to ignore it, tried to focus on the mission, but I can't anymore. What we've shared, it's too powerful. It changes everything." Kale's throat tightened as he listened to her. He knew she was right. Their connection, their love, had shifted the course of everything. But it wasn't just about them anymore. It was about the future, her future with her people, his future with humanity. And the choices they made now would ripple across both their worlds. "I feel it too," Kale admitted, stepping closer until he was standing directly in front of her. "But I don't know how to move forward from here. We're tied to two different worlds, two different paths. And now, we have to make a choice." Talia's violet eyes shimmered with unshed tears, though she kept her composure. She had always been so strong, so controlled, but here, in this moment with him, she allowed herself to be vulnerable. Kale could feel her inner conflict: the pull of duty, the weight of her responsibilities, and the love she felt for him that she couldn't deny. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "How do we choose?" Kale took a deep breath, feeling the enormity of the decision weigh on his shoulders. He reached out, taking her hands in his, their fingers entwining effortlessly. Her touch sent a familiar warmth through him, a reminder of everything they had shared, everything they still had. "We don't have to choose between love and duty," he said softly, his voice filled with quiet determination. "We can find another way." Talia looked at him, her expression filled with both hope and uncertainty. "What do you mean?" Kale squeezed her hands, his gaze unwavering as he spoke. "We fight for both. We don't have to give up one for the other. I love you, Talia, and I know you love me. But that doesn't mean we abandon our responsibilities. It means we fight for a future where we can have both, where we can be together and still serve our people." Talia's eyes widened, her emotions flooding through their bond. Kale could feel the conflict within her, the hope that flared at his words, the fear of the unknown, the worry that it might be impossible. But beneath it all, there was a spark of belief, a willingness to trust in the love they had found. "And what if we fail?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "What if we lose everything?" Kale smiled softly, brushing a strand of her hair away from her face. "We won't. Not as long as we have each other. We'll face whatever comes together. And even if we stumble, even if we fall, we'll get back up. Because what we have is worth fighting for." Talia's breath hitched, and for a moment they simply stood there, staring into each other's eyes, the weight of their love pressing between them. The decision wasn't easy. Nothing about this was easy, but Kale knew in his heart that they could make it work. They could carve out a future where their love and their duty could coexist. Slowly, Talia nodded, her expression softening as the resolution settled over her. She stepped forward, wrapping her arms around Kale, pulling him into a tight embrace. He could feel her love, her strength, flowing through the bond, and it filled him with a sense of peace he hadn't known he needed. "You're right," she whispered against his chest. "We'll find a way. Together." Kale held her close, his heart swelling with emotion as the weight of their decisions settled between them. It wouldn't be easy, but it was the only path that felt right. They had chosen each other, and that choice would guide them through whatever challenges lay ahead. As they stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, the stars outside the observation deck continued their slow dance across the sky, a reminder of the vast, uncharted future that awaited them. And for the first time, Kale didn't feel afraid. He felt hopeful. Because love had guided their decision, and that love would see them through.